I was sitting in my home office in Phoenix, Arizona, watching the temperature gauge on my laptop climb as the power grid flickered for the third time that afternoon, when everything suddenly went dark. The summer heat had been brutal that week in July, pushing the electrical infrastructure to its absolute limits. I had been expecting this, which was exactly why I had installed a whole house backup generator system 6 months earlier. Within seconds of the grid failure, my generator kicked in automatically, and the familiar hum of electricity returned to my home. The air conditioning resumed its blessed work, my refrigerator continued running, and my computer rebooted without issue. My name is Warren Jacobson, and I had lived in the Sunset Ridge community for 3 years. It was a planned development with about 200 homes, all built in the same southwestern style with terracotta roofs and stucco exteriors. The Homeowners Association had always been active, perhaps too active for my taste, but I had managed to avoid most of their drama by keeping my head down and following the rules. I maintained my lawn, painted my house the approved shade of beige, and never left my trash cans visible from the street for more than a few hours after pickup. The generator had been a significant investment, nearly $15,000 including installation, but as a freelance software developer who worked from home, losing power meant losing income. I had done my research, obtained all the necessary permits from the city, and even checked the HOA bylaws to make sure there were no restrictions. There were none. The covenants mentioned nothing about backup generators, and my installation was completely compliant with all local codes. I was back at work, debugging a particularly nasty piece of code when my doorbell rang about 20 minutes after the outage began. Through the window, I could see my neighbor from across the street, Patricia Morrison, standing on my porch. Patricia was the president of the Sunset Ridge HOA, a position she had held for the past 4 years and guarded more jealously than a dragon guards gold. She was in her early 50s, with short blonde hair that never moved regardless of wind conditions, courtesy of what must have been industrial-strength hairspray. She wore white capri pants and a floral blouse despite the heat, and her expression already told me this was not a friendly social call. I opened the door, immediately feeling the wave of heat from outside. "Hi, Patricia, what can I do for you?" "Warren, I need to speak with you about your generator," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. Her voice had that particular tone that people use when they are trying to sound reasonable while making unreasonable demands. "What about it?" I asked, genuinely confused. The unit was installed on the side of my house, properly screened by landscaping as required by city code, and while it made some noise, it was well within acceptable decibel levels. "Well, as you can see, the entire neighborhood is without power," she said, gesturing broadly at the street behind her. "Several residents are suffering in this heat, and it has come to my attention that you have backup power. As HOA president, I am requesting that you share your generator capacity with the community during this emergency." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she had just said. "You want me to share my generator?" "That's correct. We need to set up extension cords to at least the surrounding homes. Mrs. Henderson next door is elderly and needs to keep her medication refrigerated. The Pattersons have a newborn who needs a cool environment. This is a community, Warren, and we need to act like one. Patricia, my generator is designed to power my home. It's not a commercial unit. I cannot safely run extension cords to other houses, and even if I could, it would overload the system." Her expression hardened. "Are you refusing to help your neighbors in a time of crisis?" "I'm explaining that what you're asking is not physically possible or safe. If people need help, They should go to a cooling center. The city always opens them during outages. That's unacceptable. People should not have to leave their homes. You have the resources to help, and I am officially requesting, as HOA president, that you provide assistance. I felt my patience beginning to wear thin. Patricia, I'm not refusing to be a good neighbor. I'm telling you that what you're asking cannot be done safely. My generator powers my house. It's hardwired into my electrical system. I cannot just run extension cords to other homes without creating a serious safety hazard, and even if I could, the generator would be overloaded. Then you can prioritize, she snapped. Turn off your own air conditioning and use the generator capacity for Mrs. Henderson's refrigerator. No, I said firmly. I'm not going to do that. I installed this generator at my own expense for my own use. There is no HOA rule, no law, and no legal obligation for me to share it. Patricia's face flushed red. This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that tears communities apart. I will be bringing this to the HOA board, and we will be discussing consequences for your refusal to cooperate. You do that, I said. And while you're at it, maybe check the bylaws and see if you actually have any authority to demand this. She turned and marched back across the street, her white caprice practically glowing in the harsh afternoon sun. I closed the door and returned to my office, but I found it hard to concentrate. The audacity of her demand was stunning, but what bothered me more was her threat about consequences. The power stayed out for another 6 hours. My generator performed flawlessly, keeping my home comfortable and my equipment running. I saw several of my neighbors leave, presumably heading to cooling centers or hotels, but many stayed. Through my window, I could see people sitting on their porches, trying to catch any breeze that might offer relief from the 110-degree heat. I felt guilty, but I also felt angry. I had planned ahead. I had invested my own money, and now I was being made to feel like the bad guy for not solving everyone else's problems. The power came back on around 8 in the evening, just as the sun was setting. My generator automatically switched off and the neighborhood returned to its normal state. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. It informed me that an emergency board meeting had been called to discuss my refusal to cooperate during a community emergency, and that my presence was requested, but not required. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening at the community center. I spent the weekend researching HOA law in Arizona. I wanted to be prepared for whatever nonsense Patricia was planning. What I found was both reassuring and concerning. The reassuring part was that HOAs could not arbitrarily create new rules or enforce obligations that were not in the covenants. The concerning part was that HOA boards often tried to do exactly that, and fighting them could be expensive and time-consuming. On Tuesday evening, I walked to the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was used for HOA meetings and the occasional community event. The parking lot was fuller than I had ever seen it, which did not bode well. Apparently, Patricia had drummed up quite an audience. Inside, the main room had been set up with folding chairs facing a table where the board members sat. Patricia was in the center, flanked by 4 other board members. I recognized them all, though I had never interacted with most of them beyond polite waves. There was Donald Kemp, a retired accountant who served as treasurer, Susan Wright, the secretary, Marcus Bradley, who owned a local real estate business, and Linda Hoffman, who I knew had sided with Patricia on virtually every issue that had ever come before the board. The room was packed with at least 50 residents, far more than typically attended these meetings. I found a seat in the back and waited. Patricia called the meeting to order with a bang of a gavel that seemed unnecessarily dramatic. "Thank you all for coming. We have an important matter to discuss this evening regarding community cooperation and emergency preparedness." She went on to describe the power outage, painting a picture of suffering residents and heroic neighbors helping each other. And then she got to me. "Unfortunately, not everyone shares the community spirit that makes Sunset Ridge such a wonderful place to live." Warren Jacobson, despite having the resources to help his neighbors, refused to share his backup generator during the crisis. There were murmurs throughout the room. I could feel eyes turning toward me. "Mrs. Henderson, would you like to share your experience?" Patricia asked. An elderly woman in the front row stood up. She was in her 70s, thin and frail looking. "I had to throw away over $200 worth of medication because my refrigerator was out for 6 hours, she said, her voice shaking. "I asked Warren if he could help and he said no." That was a lie. Mrs. Henderson had never come to my door. But before I could object, Patricia called on another resident. "The heat was dangerous for our baby," a young man said, standing up with a woman beside him holding an infant. "We had to drive to a hotel, which cost us money we did not have budgeted." One after another, residents stood up to share their hardships from the outage. Some of their complaints were legitimate. Others were exaggerated, but all of them were being directed at me as if I were personally responsible for the power grid failing. Finally, Patricia looked directly at me. "Warren, would you like to explain to your neighbors why you refuse to help?" I stood up, feeling my heart pounding. Public speaking was not my strength, but I was not going to sit silently while I was vilified. I didn't refuse to help. I explained that what was being asked was not possible. "My generator is designed to power my house, not multiple homes. It's hardwired into my electrical system. Running extension cords to other houses would create serious safety hazards, including risk of fire and electrocution. Even if it could be done safely, which it cannot, the generator would be immediately overloaded and shut down, helping no one." "You could have prioritized," Patricia interrupted. "You could have turned off your own air conditioning and used that capacity to help Mrs. Henderson." "No, I could not have," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That's not how whole house generators work. I cannot selectively provide power to other homes through my system, and even if I could, I have no legal obligation to do so. I installed that generator at my own expense, with my own money, for my own use." "So you admit you put your own comfort above the health and safety of your neighbors," Patricia said. "I admit that I am not responsible for solving problems caused by the power company," I replied. "If there had been a real medical emergency, people should have called 911. If people needed cooling, the city opened centers specifically for that purpose. I am not being selfish by using equipment I purchased for its intended purpose. The HOA has a responsibility to promote community welfare," Patricia said, "and residents have a responsibility to contribute to that welfare." "Show me where in the covenants it says I have to share my personal property," I challenged. "It's an implied obligation," she said. "Part of being a good community member. Implied obligations are not legally enforceable," I said. "And I am not a bad community member for declining to do something that is both impossible and unsafe." The room erupted in arguments, with some people supporting Patricia and others questioning her logic. It was chaos for several minutes until Patricia banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! We will have order!" she shouted. "The board will now discuss potential actions." The board members huddled together, speaking in low voices while the rest of us waited. I used the time to look around the room, trying to gauge the mood. It was mixed. Some people were glaring at me with genuine anger, others looked uncomfortable, and a few seemed supportive but unwilling to speak up. After about 10 minutes, Patricia turned back to the room. The board has decided to implement a new community emergency response policy. All residents with backup power capabilities will be required to register their systems with the HOA and make them available for community use during outages. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day. You cannot do that, I said immediately. You cannot create new obligations that are not in the covenants without a vote of the membership. This is an emergency safety measure, Patricia said. The board has the authority to implement safety policies. Only within the scope of existing covenants, I said. You are inventing new obligations. That requires amending the covenants, which requires a vote. The board disagrees with your interpretation, Patricia said coldly. The policy will take effect immediately. All residents with backup power systems have 7 days to register them with the HOA office. I felt rage building in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I will not be complying with this policy. If you attempt to fine me, I will take legal action. That is your right, Patricia said. Just as it is the board's right to enforce community policies. This meeting is adjourned. People began filing out, many of them giving me hostile looks. A few approached me, though, including a man I recognized as living a few streets over. "Hey, I'm Victor Mendoza," he said, extending his hand. "I just want you to know that I think what they are doing is ridiculous. I work in electrical contracting, and everything you said was correct. You cannot safely share a whole house generator like they are demanding." "Thanks," I said, shaking his hand. "I appreciate that. It feels like I'm going crazy." "Patricia has gotten worse over the years," he said. "She loves the power of being HOA president, but this is a step too far. If you need an expert witness or a statement about the electrical issues, let me know." I thanked him and got his contact information. Another resident, a woman named Rachel Chen, also approached to offer support. "I'm a lawyer, though not in HOA law," she said. "But I know enough to tell you that what they are trying to do is not legal. You might want to consult with someone who specializes in this area." I left the meeting feeling both validated and exhausted. The fight was just beginning, and I knew Patricia was not going to back down easily. The next morning, I called a lawyer whose name I had found during my research. His name was Martin Greaves, and his practice focused primarily on HOA disputes. His paralegal scheduled a consultation for that afternoon. Martin's office was in Scottsdale, about 30 minutes from my house. He was in his 60s, with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he had seen plenty of HOA battles. We sat in his office, and I explained the situation from beginning to end. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "HOA overreach is common, but this is particularly egregious. They have absolutely no authority to demand access to your personal property, and they definitely cannot create new obligations without following the proper amendment procedures." "So what do I do?" I asked. "First, do not comply with their registration demand. Second, document everything. Keep records of all communications with the HOA. Third, if they attempt to fine you, do not pay. Let them know in writing that you dispute the fine and consider it invalid. Fourth, if they continue to pursue this, we will file an injunction to stop enforcement and potentially sue for declaratory relief." "How much is this going to cost?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "If it goes to court, it could be anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000, he said honestly. "But most of these cases settle once the HOA realizes they are going to lose. Boards are supposed to be guided by the best interests of the community, and wasting money on unwinnable lawsuits is not in anyone's best interest. I will draft a letter to the board explaining why their policy is invalid and giving them an opportunity to rescind it. That might be enough. I authorized him to send the letter and left his office feeling slightly more optimistic. At least I had someone on my side who knew what they were doing. The letter was sent 2 days later via certified mail. Martin had copied me on it, and I had to admire his direct but professional tone. He laid out exactly why the HOA's new policy was unenforceable, cited relevant Arizona statutes and case law, and warned that any attempt to fine or penalize me would result in immediate legal action. Patricia's response came within 24 hours, not to Martin, but directly to me via email. Your attempt to bully the board with legal threats is noted. The policy stands, and you have 5 days remaining to register your generator. Failure to comply will result in fines as previously stated. I forwarded the email to Martin, who called me immediately. She is making this very easy for us, he said. She is essentially admitting that they are going to proceed despite being informed that their actions are illegal. Keep that email. It's evidence of bad faith. The 7-day deadline came and went. I did not register my generator. 3 days later, I received a notice from the HOA that I was being fined $500 for failure to comply with community policies. The notice included instructions for payment and a warning that continued non-compliance would result in additional daily fines. Martin immediately filed a complaint in Maricopa County Superior Court, seeking an injunction against the HOA to prevent enforcement of the policy and to stop the fines. He also filed a claim for declaratory relief, asking the court to rule definitively that the HOA's policy was invalid. The court scheduled a hearing on the injunction request for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, the HOA continued to send me daily fine notices. The total was now approaching $10,000. Life in the neighborhood became increasingly uncomfortable. Patricia had apparently been campaigning against me because the hostility from some residents was palpable. People who had previously been friendly now ignored me or openly glared. My mailbox was vandalized twice, once with spray paint calling me selfish and once with eggs. I reported both incidents to the police, who took reports but told me there was little they could do without evidence of who did it. Not everyone turned against me, though. Victor Mendoza stopped by several times to check on me and reiterate his support. Rachel Chen sent me encouraging emails with articles about similar HOA disputes, and a few other neighbors quietly expressed their disagreement with what Patricia was doing, though most were afraid to speak publicly for fear of becoming targets themselves. The hearing finally arrived. Martin and I met at the courthouse, and we went through security to the courtroom where our case was scheduled. Patricia was there with the rest of the board and their lawyer, a stern-looking woman named Ellen Kramer, who specialized in representing HOAs. The judge was the Honorable Thomas Riley, a middle-aged man with a reputation for being no-nonsense but fair. He listened as Martin presented our case, arguing that the HOA had exceeded its authority by creating new obligations without following proper procedures, that the policy violated my property rights, and that the fines were being assessed in bad faith. Ellen Kramer argued that the HOA had broad authority to implement safety policies, that community welfare was paramount, and that my refusal to cooperate was detrimental to the neighborhood. Judge Riley asked several pointed questions, particularly about whether the original covenants contained any language that could be construed as supporting the HOA's position. Ellen struggled to provide convincing answers, ultimately falling back on vague assertions about implied community obligations. After about 90 minutes of arguments, Judge Riley announced his decision. I am granting the injunction. The HOA is ordered to immediately cease enforcement of the emergency power sharing policy and to stop assessing fines against Mr. Jacobson. The policy, as implemented, exceeds the authority granted to the board under the community covenants and violates Mr. Jacobson's property rights. If the HOA wishes to implement such a policy, it must follow proper procedures to amend the covenants, which requires a vote of the membership. All fines assessed against Mr. Jacobson under this policy are void and must be rescinded. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Martin shook my hand, looking satisfied. Across the room, Patricia looked like she had bitten into a lemon, but the fight was not over. The judge's ruling only addressed the injunction and the specific policy. We still had the declaratory relief claim pending, and I suspected Patricia was going to continue causing problems. Over the next few weeks, things seemed to calm down. The HOA sent me a terse letter acknowledging that the fines had been rescinded and that they would not be pursuing further enforcement of the policy. Martin advised me that we should continue with the declaratory relief claim to get a final judgment, but that it would likely be resolved in our favor based on the judge's comments during the hearing. I thought the worst was behind me. I should have known better. About a month after the hearing, I received another notice from the HOA. This one informed me that I was being fined for aesthetic violations. According to the notice, my generator installation was not properly screened and was visible from the street, violating community standards. This was absurd. The generator had been in the exact same location for over 6 months, properly screened by shrubs and a decorative fence as required by city code. It was barely visible, and only if you specifically looked for it. The HOA had never mentioned any issue with it before. I took photos documenting that the generator was not visible from the street under normal circumstances. I compared my installation to several other visible utility installations in the neighborhood that the HOA had never complained about, and I forwarded everything to Martin. "This is retaliation," Martin said when I called him. "They are trying to punish you for successfully challenging their authority. We are going to add this to our complaint and potentially file a separate claim for harassment." He sent another letter to the HOA, this one more sharply worded than the first. He pointed out that the aesthetic complaint was pretextual and retaliatory, that the generator installation was compliant with all applicable standards, and that any attempt to fine or penalize me would be met with immediate legal action, including potential claims for damages. The HOA responded by scheduling a hearing to determine whether the aesthetic violation was valid. I was given notice to appear before the board to contest the violation. I was done playing nice. I showed up to the hearing with Martin, Victor Mendoza, and a stack of documentation including photos, city permit records, and examples of other installations in the neighborhood that were far more visible than mine. Patricia opened the hearing with her usual self-righteousness. "Mr. Jacobson, you are here to address a complaint that your generator installation is not adequately screened and violates our community aesthetic standards." Martin did not let me answer. He stood up and addressed the board directly. "Before we proceed, I want to make it clear that this hearing is a sham. The generator installation has been in place for over 6 months without any complaint. It is fully compliant with city codes and the HOA's own standards. This complaint was only filed after Mr. Jacobson successfully challenged the board's illegal power sharing policy. This is transparent retaliation, and if the board proceeds with any fines or penalties, We will be filing a lawsuit for harassment, abuse of authority, and potentially seeking damages, including attorney fees and costs." Patricia's face flushed. "We have a right to enforce community standards." "You have a right to enforce them consistently and in good faith," Martin replied. "What you do not have a right to do is target individual homeowners for retaliation because they dared to stand up to you." Ellen Kramer, the HOA's lawyer who was also present at this hearing, whispered something to Patricia. The board members conferred quietly. Finally, Patricia spoke again. "The board will take the matter under advisement." "That's not good enough," Martin said. "I want a ruling right now. Either the board finds that there is no violation, or we will be filing additional legal action tomorrow morning." More whispered consultation. Ellen Kramer looked uncomfortable. Finally, she addressed the board loud enough for everyone to hear. "I advise the board to dismiss the complaint. The evidence does not support a finding of violation, and proceeding further exposes the HOA to significant legal liability." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but the other board members were nodding. Donald Kemp, the treasurer, spoke up for the first time. "I move that we dismiss the aesthetic complaint against Mr. Jacobson's property." "Second," said Marcus Bradley quickly. The vote was 4-1, with only Patricia voting against. The complaint was dismissed. As we left the community center, Martin turned to me. "She is not going to stop." Patricia sees this as a personal battle now. You need to be prepared for continued harassment. He was right. Over the next several months, I received multiple complaints about various trivial issues. My trash cans were allegedly visible from the street for too long, though they were not. My lawn supposedly did not meet standards, though it was perfectly maintained. I was accused of parking a commercial vehicle in my driveway, though my personal truck had no commercial markings. Each complaint was documented and refuted. Martin sent increasingly stern letters to the HOA, warning about harassment and abuse of process. The legal fees were piling up, and I was getting exhausted from the constant battle. Then something changed. I started hearing rumors that other residents were becoming dissatisfied with Patricia's leadership. The legal fees from fighting me were coming out of the HOA budget, which meant higher assessments for everyone. People were starting to ask why the board was wasting money on personal vendettas instead of maintaining common areas and providing community services. Victor Mendoza approached me one evening while I was checking my mail. "There is a group of us who are talking about trying to recall Patricia from the board," he said quietly. "We have been reaching out to other homeowners, and there is a lot of frustration with how she has been handling things, not just with you but with other issues too. Would you be willing to support the effort?" "Absolutely," I said. "What do you need from me?" "Right now, just signatures on a petition. We need 20% of homeowners to sign to trigger a recall vote. Once we have that, we can call a special meeting and hold an election." I signed the petition and started quietly spreading the word among the few neighbors I still had good relationships with. The effort gained momentum faster than any of us expected. Within 3 weeks, Victor had collected signatures from over 30% of the homeowners, well above the required threshold. A special meeting was called for a Saturday morning in October. The weather had finally cooled down, and there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Martin had advised me that recall votes could go either way depending on who showed up, but he thought we had a good chance based on the level of dissatisfaction he had been hearing about. The community center was packed, even more crowded than it had been for the emergency meeting about my generator. Patricia sat at the board table looking defiant. The other board members looked nervous, probably worried that they might be next. Victor, as the petition organizer, was given the floor to explain the reasons for the recall. He was eloquent and measured, outlining Patricia's pattern of overreach, her misuse of HOA funds for legally questionable actions, and her creation of a hostile and divisive atmosphere in the community. Patricia was given an opportunity to defend herself. She blamed me for everything, claiming that I had poisoned the community with my selfishness and litigiousness. She portrayed herself as a victim trying to do her best for the neighborhood in the face of unreasonable opposition. Then the vote was held. It was done by secret ballot to prevent intimidation. Every homeowner in good standing was allowed one vote. The counting took nearly an hour because of the high turnout. The result was not even close. Patricia was recalled by a vote of 68% in favor of removal. There was audible relief in the room when the result was announced. Patricia gathered her things and left without another word, her face rigid with anger. An interim president was appointed by the remaining board members, a retired teacher named Gregory Foster, who had a reputation for being reasonable and fair. One of his first acts was to authorize a settlement with me for all the legal fees I had incurred defending against the HOA's actions. The board recognizes that the previous administration acted improperly, Gregory said in a meeting where the settlement was discussed. Mr. Jacobson was defending his legitimate rights, and the HOA should never have forced him into that position. We are offering a settlement of $25,000 to cover his legal fees and compensate him for the harassment he endured. Martin negotiated the final amount to $30,000, which fully covered my legal bills and gave me some compensation for the months of stress. The settlement included language acknowledging that the HOA's actions had been improper and agreeing not to pursue any further complaints related to my generator or any other retaliatory matters. I accepted the settlement. The declaratory relief claim was dismissed as moot since the HOA had formally rescinded the policy and acknowledged its invalidity. Life in Sunset Ridge slowly returned to normal. Gregory Foster proved to be a competent and fair HOA president. He focused on actual community needs like maintaining landscaping and organizing neighborhood events, rather than on power trips and personal vendettas. Patricia moved out of the neighborhood about 6 months after the recall. I heard through the grapevine that she had bought a condo in a different development, hopefully one where she would not have the opportunity to make other people's lives miserable. The following summer brought another power outage, this one lasting even longer than the first. My generator performed perfectly, keeping my home comfortable and functional. This time, no one knocked on my door to demand that I share my power. Instead, several neighbors who had learned from the previous year's experience had installed their own backup systems. Victor Mendoza had even started a side business helping people design and install appropriate backup power solutions for their homes. I ran into Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store a few months after everything settled down. She looked embarrassed when she saw me. "Mr. Jacobson, I owe you an apology," she said. "Patricia came to me and told me what to say at that meeting. She said it would help the community. I never actually asked you for help during the outage and I should not have lied about that. I'm sorry." "I appreciate you telling me that," I said. "Patricia manipulated a lot of people. I do not hold it against you." "If I had known what she was really like, I never would have supported her," Mrs. Henderson said. "Thank you for standing up to her. A lot of us were too afraid." That conversation helped me let go of some of the anger I had been carrying. Patricia had been the real problem, not the neighbors who had been caught up in her schemes. Looking back on the whole ordeal now, several years later, I have mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I am proud that I stood my ground and did not let the HOA bully me into surrendering my rights. On the other hand, I wish it had never been necessary. The stress, the expense, and the damage to neighborhood relationships took a toll that lasted long after the legal battle was over. But there were positive outcomes too. The recall of Patricia led to better HOA governance in Sunset Ridge. Gregory Foster served 2 successful terms as president and was followed by other reasonable board members who focused on actual community needs rather than power games. The neighborhood became a more pleasant place to live, with less drama and more cooperation. I also learned valuable lessons about HOA law, my rights as a homeowner, and the importance of standing up to unreasonable authority. I made some good friends through the ordeal, particularly Victor Mendoza and Rachel Chen, who had supported me when others turned away. My generator is still sitting on the side of my house, properly screened and fully functional. It kicks on automatically whenever the power goes out, which happens at least a few times every summer. Each time it does, I feel a small sense of satisfaction knowing that I fought for my right to own and use it, and I won. The experience also taught me to be more engaged in HOA governance. I started attending board meetings regularly, not to cause trouble but to stay informed and to support reasonable policies. I even served on a committee that revised some of the community covenants to make them clearer and more enforceable, closing loopholes that could be exploited by future Patricias. One lasting impact was that the community adopted an actual emergency preparedness plan, one that made sense and did not involve forcing homeowners to share private resources. The plan included information about city cooling centers, recommendations for emergency supplies, and a voluntary buddy system where neighbors could check on each other during outages. It was the kind of community-minded approach that Patricia could have championed if she had been genuinely interested in helping people rather than controlling them. I still work from home, still write software, and still appreciate the peace and quiet of my home office. The generator hums along whenever it is needed, a reliable backup system that I am grateful to have. But it is more than just a piece of equipment now. It is a reminder of a battle fought and won, of rights defended and authority challenged. Would I do anything differently if I could go back? Maybe I would have tried harder to build relationships with other homeowners earlier, so I had more support when the conflict began. Maybe I would have been more proactive in HOA governance from the start, potentially preventing someone like Patricia from accumulating so much unchecked power. But overall, I think I handled it the right way. I stood firm on principle, I used the legal system appropriately, and I did not compromise my rights just to avoid conflict. Those are values worth defending, even when it is difficult and expensive to do so. The story spread beyond Sunset Ridge. Other HOA disputes in the Phoenix area sometimes referenced my case. Martin Greaves told me that he had represented several other homeowners in similar battles, and he always cited the precedent from my case. Apparently, Judge Riley's ruling had become something of a landmark in local HOA law, establishing clear limits on what boards could demand from homeowners. I never sued Patricia personally, though Martin suggested it might be possible to pursue individual liability for some of her actions. I decided against it. The recall was punishment enough, and I wanted to move forward rather than stay mired in conflict. Revenge is not as satisfying as people think, and it definitely is not worth the time and energy it consumes. These days, when new residents move into Sunset Ridge, they sometimes hear about the generator incident as part of the neighborhood lore. The story has probably grown in the telling, with various embellishments and exaggerations. But the core truth remains. A homeowner stood up to HOA overreach and won, and the community is better for it. I still see some of the people who sided with Patricia during the conflict. Most of them eventually apologized, or at least acknowledged that they had been misled. A few never did, and there remains some residual awkwardness in those interactions. But time heals most wounds, and the neighborhood has largely moved past the divisions that Patricia created. One unexpected benefit of the whole experience was that it made me more confident in dealing with other life challenges. If I could stand up to an entire HOA board and win, I could handle difficult clients, negotiate better contracts, and advocate for myself in situations where I previously might have backed down. The experience was empowering in ways I did not fully appreciate until later. Victor Mendoza's backup power business thrived, and he ended up hiring 2 employees to help with installations. He always joked that he should pay me a referral fee since my battle with the HOA had made people more aware of the benefits of backup power. I joked back that he should pay Patricia since her unreasonable demands had been the best advertising his business could have asked for. Rachel Chen, the lawyer who had offered early support, ended up adding HOA law to her practice areas. She said my case had inspired her to help other homeowners who were being bullied by their associations. We had coffee occasionally, and she would update me on cases she was handling. It was satisfying to know that some good had come from my struggle, that other people were being helped because I had fought back. The legal documents from my case, the pleadings and the judge's orders, became teaching materials. Martin Greaves used them in presentations at legal conferences about HOA law. A local law school professor even asked permission to include the case in a textbook about property law and homeowner associations. I agreed, hoping that future lawyers would learn from what happened and be better prepared to defend homeowners' rights. Years have passed since that first power outage and Patricia's unreasonable demand. The memory has faded from sharp urgency to a story I tell sometimes, a chapter of my life that shaped who I am but no longer defines my daily existence. The generator still sits on the side of my house, still faithfully providing backup power when needed. But now it is just a useful appliance, not a symbol of conflict and resistance. I think about what might have happened if I had given in to Patricia's initial demand. If I had tried to run extension cords to other houses, someone might have been hurt. The electrical hazards were real, not just excuses. If I had set the precedent that the HOA could demand access to private property for community use, where would it have ended? Today they want your generator. Tomorrow they want your tools. Next week they want to store community equipment in your garage. Property rights matter. Individual autonomy matters. And sometimes defending those principles requires standing alone against pressure to conform and cooperate. It is not selfishness to maintain appropriate boundaries. It is not community spirit to surrender your rights to satisfy someone else's demands. The whole experience reinforced my belief that HOAs, while they can serve useful purposes in maintaining common areas and enforcing reasonable standards, require constant vigilance to prevent abuse. The combination of limited power and limited accountability creates opportunities for petty tyranny if residents are not engaged and willing to push back against overreach. I am glad I installed the generator. I am glad I stood up to Patricia. I am glad I fought the legal battle, even though it was stressful and expensive. And I am especially glad that the outcome made Sunset Ridge a better community for everyone who lives here. The Arizona sun still beats down mercilessly every summer. The power grid still struggles under the load. And my generator still hums to life whenever the electricity fails, providing reliable backup power exactly as designed. But now, I can enjoy it without conflict, without harassment, and without anyone demanding that I share what is rightfully mine. That peace of mind, that ability to live in my home and use my property without interference, was worth fighting for. It was worth every dollar spent on legal fees, every hour spent documenting complaints and preparing defenses, and every moment of stress endured during the conflict. Looking out my office window now at the quiet suburban street, at neighbors tending their lawns and children playing in yards, it is hard to remember how tense and hostile things once were. The healing has been thorough, the lessons learned have been valuable, and life has moved on. But I have not forgotten, and I never will, because the day I installed that generator, I had no idea it would become the center of such a storm. And the day Patricia knocked on my door demanding I share my power, I had no idea it would lead to months of conflict, legal battles, and eventually positive change for an entire community. Life is unpredictable that way. A simple decision to protect yourself against power outages can become a defining moment, a line in the sand, a battle for principle that resonates far beyond its immediate circumstances. I am Warren Jacobson. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, in the Sunset Ridge community, and I own a backup generator that I will never, ever be forced to share against my will. That is my right, that is my property, and that is my story.